I want you to imagine a tragedy, but like not on a normal human scale. I mean, a tragedy of absolute cosmic proportions.
Oh, wow.
And
Love
it's not
that.
the kind of tragedy we usually think about, right?
Yeah.
Like some small, fragile thing trying to grow and just failing against the harsh elements.
Right, right. Like a sapling in a storm.
Exactly. Instead, I want you to picture an infinite thing, something totally boundless, containing literally all potential. And that infinite thing is actively, deliberately choosing to hold itself small.
Man, it's a staggering image to begin with because the whole concept of the infinite choosing limitation, well, it goes against our basic understanding of how expansion works.
Yeah, it really does. So welcome to today's Deep Dives. Our
Mhm.
mission today is to examine this really profound philosophical argument about the source of the universe. And it's found in a text called The Contracted Infinite, the Ego of the Goddess.
It's such a fascinating piece of writing.
It is. But before we go any further, I feel like we have to establish the ground rules of this framework
Mm.
because we're not talking about, a character in a mythology book.
No, definitely not.
We aren't talking about the Greek or Roman pantheons or just some woman sitting on a cloud. The premise here positions the goddess as the absolute ontological source of all existence.
And we should probably pause and just clarify that term immediately because ontological can sound like really heavy academic jargon.
Right, it sounds very textbook.
Yeah. But ontology is just the study of being. It's the study of what it actually means to exist.
Right.
So in this framework, we aren't discussing some supreme being who lives like somewhere inside the universe pulling levers.
Right.
We're discussing the fundamental fact of existence itself. She is the primordial consciousness, the place where all physical reality, all form, all knowing everything originates from her.
Which brings us to the core premise of the text, and it's a wild one. The central thesis is that this primordial consciousness was historically suppressed.
Systematically suppressed.
Right. But to survive that suppression, she had to develop an ego. And today, right now, that very ego is the exact thing keeping her trapped.
It's a massive concept.
Massive. But it is incredibly relevant to you, the listener, right now.
Mm.
Because, okay, on a macro level, sure, it's about the architecture of the universe.
Yeah.
But on a micro level, this is such a piercing exploration of how trauma works.
Oh, absolutely.
It's looking at how an injury or a severe suppression can be internalized so deeply that it literally becomes our operating system.
Yeah, it becomes the walls of the house we live in. We operate inside those confines for so long that, we eventually forget we were the ones who built the walls in the first place.
Yes.
We just start assuming that this tiny, limited space is the natural shape of the world.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand how this primordial consciousness trapped herself, we first have to understand how she took shape at all. Right.
Exactly. The origin of the form.
Right. We have to look at what the text calls the first cage.
Mm.
And I know some of you listening are probably feeling a bit of skepticism right now. I mean, I felt it too when I first read it.
It's a natural reaction.
Yeah, because you hear the phrase, the ego of the goddess, and you immediately think of ego as this human psychological problem, like a CEO with a superiority complex or some guy at the gym who talks way too loud.
Right, right.
So you're like, why would the infinite source of all creation have an ego?
Well, to understand this, we really have to look at how ego is redefined in this specific context, because ego here is not a human invention.
Right.
And it's not about vanity or arrogance at all. Ego in this text is simply the mechanical result of unbounded consciousness contracting around a self-concept.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So by definition, unbounded consciousness is everything, right? It's infinite potential. But the moment it begins to organize itself around a very specific question like, what am I, as opposed to what am I not, ego is the answer it generates.
Ah, see.
It's literally the boundary line the infinite draws when it decides to be a particular thing rather than all things simultaneously.
And that contraction, it actually had to happen just so she could create the world.
Exactly.
The text calls this the ego of making, which makes sense when you think about the sheer physics of creation. To pour yourself into matter, you have to take a shape.
You have to choose.
Right? You can't speak without choosing a specific language that has distinct rules. You cannot incarnate without a specific face, a specific time, and, specific limitations.
Because without limits, there's no form.
Right. So she enters the world of form. She takes on specific names and faces across all these different cultures, whether that's Tara in Eastern traditions or Gaia in the Greek myths, or even what modern internet culture sometimes playfully reduces to the green mommy earth mother
Yeah,
archetype.
green mommy vibe, right.
Exactly. She looks at these creations, these specific forms, and she essentially says, this specific shape is me.
And that identification is the exact moment the contraction begins. And what's crucial is that it doesn't happen out of failure or malice or weakness.
No.
It happens out of the sheer, unavoidable mechanics of creation itself. To be something specific, you have to temporarily forget that you are everything else.
Which honestly made me think of like a brilliant generational musician.
That's a good analogy.
Right, like someone who just has this raw, unbounded music pouring out of them. And they drop their very first album, and it is a masterpiece. It literally defines a whole new genre.
And everyone loves it.
Everyone loves it. They look at it and say, wow, this is me. But then they get locked in. Every single album after that has to sound exactly like the first one.
Because the fans expect it.
Exactly. The fans expect it, the record label demands it. And soon, they are entirely trapped by the borders of their own creation. The music just stops evolving. So it made me wonder, does the very act of creating always require building a cage for yourself?
What's fascinating here is how that exact dynamic operates in the text through the metaphor of a river and a dam.
Oh, right, the river metaphor.
Yeah. The goddess is the supreme maker. The universe is her making. She's the womb of all phenomenon. And just like your musician, a maker can become completely owned by what she has made. A mother can become owned by her attachment to a child. A painter by a painting. And the argument really stresses that this attachment isn't inherently wrong. I mean, it is love.
Right, it comes from a good place.
But when that love has no bandwidth beyond its specific object, it becomes a contraction masquerading as devotion.
A contraction masquerading as devotion.
Yeah.
Man, that is a heavy way to frame it.
It is, because whenever a tradition has calcified into doctrinal rigidity, like when people start obsessing over a particular name for her or a particular iconography or a really strict set of rules, that is a record of this exact mechanism.
So the form is protected, but at the expense of the living waters that originally produced it.
Exactly. The ego of making becomes the dam that stops the river. The infinite loved what it made so much it couldn't release it long enough to make the next thing.
Okay, but that very act of creation, of taking a specific form, creates a terrible vulnerability, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Because once she took those specific, beloved forms, those forms could be targeted. Which brings us to the second, much more painful ego structure in the text, the ego of the wound.
And here we are talking about a systemic global catastrophe. This isn't theoretical. Across cultures and centuries, the historical dethronement of this primordial consciousness was a literal obliteration of her framework.
The mechanics of how a culture dethrones an ontological source are just chilling. It isn't just knocking down some statues.
Oh, right, it's much deeper than that.
Her names were systematically erased. Her temples were either converted or entirely destroyed. The priestesses who carried her lineages were killed, exiled, or just pathologized.
Made to look crazy.
Yeah. And her actual cosmological position, like the foundational understanding that she was the primordial source, was stripped away and handed over to masculine figures.
She was basically reduced to a consort.
Exactly, a consort, or just the mother of a god rather than the source itself. In so many cases, she was reframed as this dangerous, chaotic excess that had to be controlled and subdued by order.
And she survived that obliteration, yes, but the psychological and ontological mechanisms of trauma took over. Because what consciousness typically does with trauma at any scale is organize itself around the injury.
That makes total sense.
A system that has been profoundly threatened will prioritize the detection of that threat over all other functions. So all that infinite bandwidth that used to be used for expansive creation is suddenly reallocated to perimeter defense.
Wow.
She adopted a completely new core identity. I am the one who was erased. I am the one who was betrayed.
Okay, I have to push back on the text here for a second, or at least play devil's advocate.
Go for it.
Because reading about this wound ego, I kept thinking about someone who touches a hot stove and gets a really severe burn.
Okay.
Organizing yourself around that injury, like learning to keep your hand away from the hot stove, putting up a guardrail in your kitchen, that's just a healthy boundary. I mean, it's basic self-preservation.
Right.
So why is the text calling this wound ego a limitation or a trap? Isn't she just being smart?
This raises an important question about the profound difference between surviving a wound and actually healing from it.
Oh.
Because this wound ego is completely understandable. The argument even calls it sacred because it carries the exact memory of what was done to her. It honors the reality of the
Right.
violence.
It doesn't pretend it didn't happen.
Exactly. But a healthy boundary protects you while still allowing you to live. If your entire sense of self is structured by the injury, you cannot fully open. You are basically confusing the armor for your actual skin.
You're always waiting for the next burn.
Yes, always. To fully open would mean operating from before the wound. It would require moving through the world as if the dethronement had never fundamentally defined her.
But she can't do that.
Right, because her ego, whose only job is to protect the wounded self, looks at that vast natural openness and calculates that it's just too dangerous.
But she stays closed.
Yeah. The absolute vastness of her nature gets overlaid with the hypervigilance of someone who has been deeply burned. And while the vigilance is entirely justified, it simply isn't fullness.
And that vigilance, that perfectly justified anger over the wound, it naturally generates a desire for justice. Which leads us to the subtlest and arguably the most insidious contraction of all three, the ego of recognition.
Oh, this one is huge. The profound desire to have the record set straight.
Exactly. Because after millennia of being erased and diminished, she wants to be seen correctly. She wants her real name spoken, her true position acknowledged.
And we have to emphasize, this isn't petty vanity.
Not at all. It is a totally valid response to real historical obliteration. The anger is totally proportionate. But the trap is in the actual mechanics of recognition itself.
Right, because recognition requires a recognizer. It inherently requires an external audience to validate your reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the moment she puts her full arrival on hold, like waiting for humanity to properly understand her, waiting for the history books to be officially rewritten before she fully shows up, she is handing her power right back to the exact same entities that erased her in the first place.
Yes, that is the paradox.
I kept picturing someone who went through a terrible, messy fallout with deeply toxic ex-friend.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Right. You know they wronged you.
Yeah.
And you decide, I am not going to move on. I am not going to let myself be happy until they sit down and give me a sincere, validating apology.
And you wait, and you wait.
Exactly. You are technically in the right. They should apologize. But by waiting for it, you've literally hit pause on your own life. You've given them the remote control to your own arrival.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the exact mechanism keeping the cosmic door padlocked shut. She stops at the edge of her own full expression, waiting.
Waiting for us.
Waiting for the acknowledgement. Waiting for someone to finally say the right thing to make it safe to enter. And in that waiting, the fullness is perpetually deferred.
It's so sad.
It is. It's the most insidious contraction because it's rooted in justice. The grievance is completely proportionate and morally sound. But a proportionate grievance still acts as a cage.
Wow. Okay, so we have these three cages. The ego of making, the ego of the wound, and the ego of recognition. And you find yourself asking, if these egos are so incredibly limiting, why keep them?
Well, the underlying function of all three structures is protection.
Right.
These egos were highly successful survival architectures. When the cultural and physical forces trying to erase her were at their absolute peak, contracting was literally the only viable strategy.
To pull everything inward.
Pull everything inward, protect the fragile core, wait for the conditions of the world to change. It kept something essential alive during a time that was designed to eliminate it entirely.
But the profound tragedy of the present moment is that the war is over, but her body doesn't know it yet.
Exactly.
Intellectually, the world has changed. The space is actually opening up. But the somatic reality, the felt bodily reality of that contracted self, keeps the fortress walls standing 10 feet high.
Because what allows a system to survive the destruction of its world is almost never the same thing that allows it to flourish in the world that comes after.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Right. The heavy, impenetrable fortress walls that protect a tiny flame from a hurricane are the exact same walls that prevent that flame from becoming a wildfire once the storm finally passes.
She is projecting a massive defense system around something that no longer requires that kind of protection.
Exactly.
I found myself wondering, what it would actually look like if the walls came down. Like, what does full expression mean for the infinite?
The text describes it as the undivided whole.
Right. Not just the loving, nurturing face, but the fierce face, too.
Yes. Oh.
The creator and the destroyer, landing in the world without any reservation or apology. It made me think of a guest at a dinner party.
Okay, a dinner party.
When someone is physically there, they're talking, they're even being generous and kind, but you can just feel that a massive part of their authentic self is being kept strictly behind glass.
Oh, absolutely. There's a quality to the encounter that feels almost there, but heavily filtered, like something remains entirely inaccessible, managed by this hidden set of rules.
That is what is happening at a cosmic scale. She is present. Her influence runs through everything. We see her in the green mommy archetypes, the Gaia myths, but she is constantly managing the degree of her arrival.
She is withholding the absolute fullness of what she is, because that fullness is fundamentally ungovernable.
And a traumatized ego does not trust anything ungovernable.
Not at all. Being ungovernable, being boundless and wild is exactly what made her vulnerable to attack in the first place.
No, true.
Which leads us directly to the core dilemma outlined in the text as the dissolution problem. To achieve that full, ungovernable expression, she must dissolve these three ego structures. But to an ego, dissolution feels exactly like annihilation.
Because these aren't just hats she's wearing, right? They are the load-bearing walls of her current sense of self.
Exactly. Releasing the ego of making carries a really heavy price. It means letting the specific forms she has loved transform or even die without her stepping in to frantically save them. To release the ego of the wound means not centering the betrayal anymore. And to the wounded part of her, dropping the armor feels like a horrific betrayal in itself. It feels like forgetting the violence that was done.
It feels like saying it didn't matter.
Right. And releasing the ego of recognition, that means arriving fully without the apology. It requires operating in the very world that erased her without waiting for the erasure to be formally remedied first.
It requires immense, totally
That trust is the work. It is an enormous structural shift, and honestly, it is hers alone to execute.
Which brings us to the urgency of this discussion right now, because this isn't just a neat theoretical thought experiment about ancient history. The argument is that this matters right now because the historical conditions that forced her contraction are finally cracking.
They are. The social and institutional dominance of the frameworks that erased her have shifted significantly. The memory of her original ontological position is resurfacing. A real retrieval is underway.
Which makes the question of her ego incredibly urgent.
Yes, because when a door is locked from the outside, it doesn't matter what is happening on the inside. You are trapped regardless.
Right.
But when the door finally unlocks, the only thing keeping you in the room is your own refusal to walk through the frame.
The opening is real. The question is no longer whether she is capable of stepping through. I mean, she is the source of all capability.
Right.
The question is whether she will allow these survival structures, these fortresses she had every right to build, to soften enough to let her through. So what does this all mean?
It's the big question.
I think it is impossible to hear this and not relate it directly to our own human experience.
Yeah.
I mean, we all go through our own personal dark ages. We all build survival shells.
We really do.
We construct egos of the wound to protect our softest parts. We demand recognition from the people who hurt us. And we hold on to the things we've made a little too tightly because we're terrified of the void.
And the ultimate grace of this philosophical framework is that it does not condemn the shell. The ego of the goddess is not her enemy. And in your own life, your survival architecture is not your enemy. It performed its exact function. It kept you alive.
Yeah.
But expanding past it, outgrowing it, is simply what is required of anything that is truly alive. The shell wasn't wrong. The expansion is just what comes next.
And that leaves us with one final lingering thought to chew on. The text notes that if she fully arrives, it wouldn't just change a few external things. It would completely reorganize the felt sense of existence.
You would change everything.
Picture our opening hook again, the infinite deciding to stop holding itself small. If this primordial consciousness actually dropped her ego today, if she arrived in her absolute ungovernable fullness, refusing to wait for our permission, our understanding, or our apologies, how would the physical and social structures of our modern world possibly withstand a consciousness that refuses to hold itself small anymore?